this guy who had done litigation with Theranos and suspected it was a fraud, and added, by the way, I've just made contact with this recently departed employee who has confirmed my suspicions. And so the pathology blogger didn't know what to do with this. He ran a full-time medical practice, pathology practice, and he figured this was a job for an investigative reporter. And he remembered me and picked up the phone and called me and gave me the tip. And then over the course of the next few weeks, I pulled on that string and eventually made direct contact with the recently departed former employee. And that was the beginning.
Yeah, hi. I just had more of a process question. At what point, and was it your decision to put the time and resources into pursuing this once you realized, hey, this is a big story and has tremendous implications? And were there times along the researching of the story that you had to make a decision, yes, we're going to go forward, or maybe we shouldn't go forward?
Yeah, that's a good question. After getting the original second or third hand tip, I went to see my editor, Mike Sicanolfi, and I told him I'd gotten this tip, but it was, for it to lead anywhere, I needed to make contact with that former employee, and it was unclear whether I was going to be successful in doing that or not. And so he said, well, why don't you take 2 weeks and then come back and tell me where you're at. And I can't remember if by the time the 2 weeks had elapsed, if I'd successfully gotten the ex-employee on the phone or not. It might have taken a little bit longer than that. But the second that I did get him on the phone, given what his duties had been at Theranos and what he was telling me, I knew this story was a blockbuster. And I relayed that to Mike, and he agreed. And so at that point, we were pretty much all in.
John, thank you very much. Can you talk a little bit about what happened when Theranos sent their legal team to the offices of the Wall Street Journal, and how the Journal supported you in that confrontation?
Yeah, so that's another scene in the book. But I will try to answer that question. So, as anyone who's followed this story probably knows that Theranos' outside counsel was David Boies, and I became aware of that pretty soon after decided I was going to, do this story. And so I figured once I confronted the company with my findings that it was going to be a battle. And so what I did is, aside from having a great editor who's been at the Journal a long time and who has amassed a lot of political capital at the Journal, and who is great at championing his reporters and supporting them unflinchingly, we also brought in early on, under the tent, Jay Conte, who is now the general counsel of Dow Jones, which is the parent company of the Journal. At that point was deputy general counsel, and he was the guy who's ran point on dealing with all sensitive journalistic matters at the Journal. And so, within a couple weeks of making contact with that first whistleblower, I told Jay about the story, filled him in on what it was about, who the whistleblower was. The whistleblower was being threatened and harassed by Boies Schiller attorneys and by Theranos in-house lawyers, so there were also some legal issues that I wanted advice from Jay about. And what I would say is that I would recommend to all of you, if you guys work on tough stories that are going to be an uphill battle to get in your paper or on your website, to bring the lawyers in at an early stage and make them feel like they're part of the process rather than letting them come in, at the very last moment before publication when at the 11th hour they discover this blockbuster investigation you've got, and they have all these questions, and sometimes they'll even say, wait a minute, you know, we need to take more time, or we're not comfortable with it. And I found in this particular investigation that bringing the lawyers in very early was hugely beneficial. And then later, when I did confront Theranos with my reporting, at first I got the runaround for like 2 months. They had hired an outside PR guy, and I kept asking for an interview and for a tour of the Theranos lab, and he kept putting me off. Finally, when I saw Elizabeth Holmes one day on one of the TV screens in our newsroom, carrying forth in her black turtleneck on Charlie Rose, in addition to, you know, having been on CNBC and CBS and you know, virtually every other news outlet in America, I lost my patience, and I let this outside PR guy know that the company couldn't keep putting me off. At that point, a delegation of 7 people came to the Journal's newsroom in Midtown Manhattan. And of the 7 people, 4 were attorneys. One was a PR person, one was an opposition researcher, co-founded Fusion GPS, the firm that commissioned the infamous Trump dossier. And the 7th was a Theranos executive, but not Elizabeth Holmes nor her second in command, who was also her boyfriend, Sunny Balwani. And so we then had a very heated and confrontational 5-hour meeting in a conference room at the Journal. And I had come along with Mike, my editor, and Jay, the lawyer, for backup, because I expected fireworks. And I was not disappointed. And I'm going to let you read about the details of that meeting.
I'm just wondering, how did they get away with this for so long, and what were some of the critical points of failure that could have stopped it sooner?
Yeah, great question. They went live with their blood tests in September of 2013, first in a Walgreens store in Palo Alto, and then they expanded to Phoenix. And by the time I came around and started digging into the company, essentially, 2 years later, or was it not quite 2 years later, they had expanded to about 45 locations here in Phoenix, and they had another one, and so they had something like 47 locations in 2 states. And this had been going on for 2 years. It's incredible. You know, one question that I hope I provide some answers to in the book is, how did the retail partner, Walgreens, not do its due diligence and not ask more questions and not have more supervision over this? The answer in parts of that is, you'll see in the book, the point people at Walgreens who were in charge of this partnership were just not very good people to have in charge. One was the CFO of Walgreens at the time, who had a drinking problem and who had gotten a bunch of DUIs and had earned the nickname. His real name was Wade Miquelon, and he had earned the nickname Michelob in the hallways of Walgreens headquarters in Deerfield, Illinois, because of all these DUIs. And another guy was a doctor named Jay Rosen, who he was in his mid-60s, and he was a big believer in preventive health and in the notion of that you could encourage people to live healthier lives. And he was also a completely starry-eyed with Silicon Valley innovation. And his nickname was Dr. J. it was his self-appointed nickname. So whenever he introduced himself to someone, he would say, "Hi, I'm Dr. J, and I used to play basketball." And he thought that was a hilarious joke, and he would literally say it every time he met someone. So Dr. J and Michelob were the guys at Walgreens who were in charge of this partnership, so you get the idea. But then, I mean, how did this get under the radar or slip under the radar with regulators? I think, as some of you may know from having covered the laboratory industry and blood testing, it's sort of a complicated area because on the one hand you have the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services. Most people think of them as the agency that run the two programs, Medicare and Medicaid, but they have a third role, which is to oversee clinical laboratories in this country. And so they oversee the laboratories, and then the FDA oversees and approves the diagnostic equipment that those laboratories buy and then use in their labs. But then there are some laboratories who put together blood tests themselves with their own methods, and those are known as laboratory developed tests, or LDTs. And the FDA for decades now has not actively policed this part of the business, and technically it falls under the jurisdiction of CMS, but CMS hasn't really policed it either. And so Theranos was operating in this gray area because it was using its own device, its own proprietary device, for at least part of the test, but not commercializing it. And so therefore it was avoiding close FDA scrutiny by not commercializing the equipment. And then when state inspectors representing, enforcing CLIA would come by, they would outright mislead them and not show them the part of the lab downstairs where they had their proprietary devices. And so the state inspectors would just see a normal looking lab with Siemens machines. And so that's the other part of the answer is they lied. They outright misled CMS and the FDA. And so when you're being lied to, I think the regulators are only, you can only blame the regulators so much.
First, a process question. When you have a blockbuster story like this one, when do you decide to bring in other reporters? As soon as the story publishes, you know that Fortune and New York Times are all going to be digging into. What did you do to stay ahead of that competition? I'm sure it's in the book, but any hallucination? And second, since I have the microphone, I have to ask, who's going to play you in the movie?
Well, I'll answer the last question first. Probably a nobody, an unknown actor, because Jennifer Lawrence's rate is $20 million now a movie, and I think the budget will be 50, so she'll be taking up 20 of that 50 million. The more important question, I wanted this story to myself. So for the 9+ months that I was working on it, there was not a chance in hell that I was going to let any of my colleagues have a piece of it. Once the story broke, I was actually okay with, Mike wanted to bring in other people, and for the reasons that you mentioned, the competition and how it immediately blew up into the scandal. I didn't want to bring too many people in because I find my experience is that when you start having too many people involved, it's counterproductive. I was okay with bringing 1 or 2 people in. In the end, we mostly brought in a colleague, Chris Weaver, and then it was just me and him. But I agree that sometimes in those situations you need help, but I don't think you want to put a bunch of people on the story. I mean, I guess it depends, In this case, I didn't feel like we needed more than 1 or 2 other reporters, and we ended up doing fine doing it that way. Whoever's got the mic.
I have a question. So, given that Elizabeth Holmes and her boyfriend, knew that this was a scam. What's your best estimate on how many people within Theranos and its associated vendor community, the law firms and PR firms and so forth, how many people understood that they were working for a scam organization and were participating in the fraud?
That's another great question. Theranos operated in silos. Elizabeth and Sonny set it up so that the departments various departments of the company didn't really know what the other parts of the company were up to, and that was enforced with, key cards. And so, like, the engineering part of the company, the people who worked there had their own key card, and the people who worked in the lab or the people who worked in manufacturing just couldn't even set foot in that part of the company because they didn't have, authorization, and they didn't have the key card that would open the door. And then the lab rooms, eventually when they moved the lab across San Francisco Bay to Newark, California, had fingerprint scanners. And the shenanigans were mostly going on in the lab. They had divided the laboratory into two rooms. One they called Jurassic Park. It was the room that contained the regular off-the-shelf commercial analyzers, which they actually used for most of their tests. And the conceit was that those machines were dinosaurs that would be rendered extinct by Theranos's groundbreaking new technology, hence Jurassic Park. And then the other lab room that had the proprietary Edison devices and the hacked Siemens machines was called Normandy. And the analogy there was that they were going to take the lab industry by storm, the way American and British troops had taken the beaches of Normandy by storm in 1944. The shenanigans were taking place essentially in Normandy, and no one who didn't work in Normandy or was assigned to Normandy knew what was going on there. And so when my first story came out in mid-October 2015, there were a bunch of employees, probably the vast majority of them, who were angry at me and at the Journal because they thought they worked for a legitimate company and they had no idea what was taking place in that Normandy part of the lab.
This is sort of a follow-up from the last question. Theranos had some very high-profile board members, George Shultz and Henry Kissinger, and I believe was it Natus also on the board. Mm-hmm. And how did that seemed to give them some credibility initially? How did that come about that those people wound up on the board? Did they actively seek them out? And secondly, what did those board members know about what was going on at Theranos?
So that was the main strategy that Elizabeth Holmes used to gain validation and credibility, was to surround herself with people who were well known and well respected and had credibility. And the way that board came about is she met George Shultz, the legendary former Secretary of State under Reagan, before that Treasury Secretary and Labor Secretary under Nixon. Essentially, the guy that many people see as the guy who won the Cold War by crafting the Reagan-era foreign policy. And George Shultz lives in a big shingled house on a hill right next to the Stanford campus and is a distinguished fellow at the Hoover Institution, the conservative think tank on the Stanford campus. And Elizabeth was introduced to him by someone, I believe, from Stanford Medical School in 2011, early 2011, and then charmed George Shultz, who at that point was pushing 90. And George Shultz is someone who had a real passion for science, and believed that science had the power to really make the world a better place by dealing with things like climate change and pandemics. And so when Elizabeth started expounding on her vision and her technology, he really believed her and believed in it. And then he introduced her to these other aging ex-statesmen and military commanders who were also distinguished fellows at the Hoover Institution, people like Henry Kissinger and Perry, who had been, I believe, Secretary of Defense. William Perry had been Secretary of Defense in the Clinton administration. Sam Nunn, Bill Frist, Admiral Roughhead, James not James, I don't think James Mattis was ever at the Hoover Institution. But she did meet Mattis through Holmes at a Marine Memorial Club event in San Francisco a couple months after meeting Shultz. So the short answer is Shultz was her in with all these very distinguished, larger-than-life figures, and one by one she wooed them, gave them grants of stock in exchange for sitting on our board. And then your other answer was, at what point did they know, if at any point? And based on my reporting, they had no clue what was going on. I mean, this was a company that she controlled entirely. She had pushed through a motion in late 2013, giving her 100 votes per share, and she literally controlled 99.7% of the voting rights of the company. The board couldn't even reach a quorum without her. George Shultz, in deposition testimony, subsequently explained that it didn't matter what anyone said or what anyone recommended at board meetings, because Elizabeth was going to do what she wanted to do. I hope that answers your question.
A little bit about how the whole hype of Silicon Valley and the idea of revolutionizing, the ideas of Silicon Valley going to revolutionize this stodgy industry of healthcare and everything. How all of this contributed to make Theranos possible?
Right. So Theranos, Elizabeth and Theranos styled themselves a tech company and based themselves in Palo Alto, which is the heart, the center of gravity of Silicon Valley. And she, as you'll read in the book, Steve Jobs and Apple were her idols, and she was obsessed with becoming the second coming of Steve Jobs. And she lost sight of the fact that her company and her endeavor weren't a traditional tech venture. What she was building first and foremost was a healthcare company, a company that made a medical device. And so she sort of conflated those two things. And she really channeled the make it until you fake it ethos of Silicon Valley. There's the term coined in the early 80s in Silicon Valley called vaporware. And it referred to software or hardware that was announced with great fanfare by a company and then either never materialized or materialized years later and wasn't anything like what had been promised. And ever since then, that sort of vaporware ethos has been part of the DNA of the Valley, which is not to say that it's not coming up with real innovations every day, but there is a sort of looseness, and there's a lot of hyping. And VC, tech founders go to VCs and hype where they are and often exaggerate where they are to try to get funding and hope that reality catches up. And that's essentially what Elizabeth Holmes did. And ironically, there's another part of San Francisco Bay, not far from Palo Alto, which is South San Francisco, which is, along with San Diego, the hub for the biotech industry, where there's real medical science that takes place. And instead of basing her company geographically there and emulating the people from that industry, she chose to emulate what was essentially, the computer industry. The result is this disaster.